Katie Brooks pressed her small face against the cold window of the transport ship and watched the biggest space station she had ever seen grow larger and larger. The Galactic Academy floated in space like a giant crystal flower with towers that twisted up toward the stars and platforms that seemed to hang in the air without anything holding them up. Lights of every color she could imagine twinkled across its surface, and strange ships moved around it like busy insects. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" her father said, sitting down next to her. Commander Jake Brooks wore his best uniform, the one with all the shiny buttons that Katie liked to count when she was bored. Today he looked nervous, which was strange, because her dad was never nervous about anything. "It's really big," Katie said, still looking out the window. "Are there really aliens in there?" "Lots of them," her mother replied from across the small cabin. Dr. Lisa Brooks was reading something on her tablet, but Katie could tell she was excited. Her mom always got that happy, worried look when she was about to meet new people. "Remember what we talked about? Some of them might look very different from us, but they're all very smart and very friendly." Katie nodded, but she felt butterflies dancing in her stomach. She had seen pictures of aliens before, but she had never met any real ones. The closest she had come was watching videos of the big blue, ones with 4 arms, and the tall, thin ones that looked like walking trees. Those had seemed nice enough on the screen, but meeting them in person was going to be different. The transport ship docked with a soft bump that made Katie's ears pop. Through the speakers, a voice said something in a language that sounded like music mixed with bird songs. Then the same voice spoke in English. "Welcome to Kepler Station, home of the Galactic Academy. All new arrivals, please proceed to Docking Bay 7 for orientation and processing." Katie took her mom's hand as they walked through the airlock. The corridor on the other side was much bigger than any hallway she had ever seen. The ceiling was so high that she had to bend her neck back to see the top, and the walls seemed to glow with their own soft light. Strange symbols moved across the walls like writing, but not any kind of writing Katie had ever learned. Other passengers walked past them, and Katie tried not to stare. There was a family of the blue 4-armed aliens she had seen in videos. They were even bigger in person, and their skin looked like it was covered in tiny scales that caught the light. A group of tall, thin creatures that reminded Katie of praying mantises clicked and whistled to each other as they walked. Behind them came something that looked like a walking pile of colorful rocks, moving without legs that Katie could see. "This way," her father said, checking a map on his tablet. "The Academy's education department is in the crystal sector." They rode in a transport pod that moved through clear tubes running through the station. Katie watched the amazing sights pass by outside. Gardens floated in the air with no dirt she could see, filled with plants that glowed and moved on their own. Markets sold things she couldn't even guess at, tended by aliens of every shape and size. In one area, she saw what looked like a small ocean hanging in a bubble, with fish-like creatures swimming through it. "Katie, look at this," her mother said, pointing to a group of young aliens playing some kind of game in a park. "Those might be some of your new classmates." The alien children were about Katie's size, but they didn't look anything like human children. Some had extra arms or legs, others had different numbers of eyes, and a few seemed to be made of light instead of solid matter. They were playing with balls that floated in the air and changed colors when touched. One of the children pointed at something, and the ball moved toward it without anyone throwing it. Katie felt very small and very human all of a sudden. How was she supposed to make friends with kids who could move things with their minds? What if they thought she was stupid because she couldn't do anything special? The transport pod stopped at a platform made of something that looked like green glass. A sign in many different languages pointed toward a building that seemed to be grown rather than built, with walls that curved like the inside of a seashell dot inside the building. they met their first Academy official. Professor Zeth Kalar was one of the blue four-armed aliens, but he was bigger than the family they had seen earlier. His compound eyes looked like clusters of tiny jewels, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like it came from deep underwater. "Welcome to the Galactic Academy," he said, shaking hands with Katie's parents, using two of his four arms. "I am Professor Zeth Kalar, Director of Student Evaluation. You must be the Brooks family from Earth." "Yes, sir," Katie's father replied. "This is my wife, Dr. Lisa Brooks, and our daughter Katie." Professor Zeth Kalar looked down at Katie with all of his many eyes. She tried not to hide behind her mother's leg, but it was hard not to feel intimidated. The professor was at least 3 times her size, and she could see her reflection repeated dozens of times in his compound eyes. "So this is our first human student," he said. His voice wasn't mean, but it sounded like he was talking about something interesting but not very important, like a new kind of bug. "We have prepared a special program for her. Of course, we understand that human cognitive abilities are somewhat limited compared to our other students, so we have adjusted our expectations accordingly." Katie felt her cheeks get hot. She might be only 8 years old, but she knew when someone was being polite about calling her dumb. Her parents must have felt the same way, because her father's jaw got tight the way it did when he was trying not to say something that would get him in trouble. "Katie is a very bright child," her mother said in her calm doctor voice. "She's always been excellent at solving problems and puzzles." "Of course," Professor Zeth Kalar said, but Katie could tell he didn't really believe it. "We have had great success with primitive species before. With proper guidance and simplified materials, I'm sure she will do adequately." He led them through more corridors filled with amazing sights. They passed classrooms where students sat in the air without chairs, writing with beams of light on walls made of what looked like solid water. In one room, a teacher who looked like a living flame was showing students how to build something that floated and spun by itself. In another, students were working with numbers and symbols that moved around like living things. "These are our advanced placement students," Professor Zeth Kalar explained. "They work on problems that would challenge graduate students on most worlds. Naturally, young Katie will be starting with much more basic material." They stopped at a smaller classroom where a few students sat at desks that looked more like the ones Katie was used to. The students here were still alien, but they looked younger and less intimidating than the ones in the other rooms. "This is where Katie will begin her studies," the professor said. "We start with simple pattern recognition and basic logical reasoning. Nothing too challenging." Katie looked around the room and noticed something strange. On the walls were puzzles and brain teasers that looked almost exactly like the ones in her puzzle books at home. Some of them she had solved before, and they had been fun but not too hard. If these were the simple ones, she wondered what the hard ones looked like. "When do I start?" she asked, speaking up for the first time since they had arrived. Professor Zeth Kalar looked surprised that she had spoken. "Tomorrow morning, but don't worry, little human. We will start very slowly and make sure you understand each step before moving on to the next." Katie nodded politely, but inside she was starting to feel a little annoyed. Everyone kept talking about her like she wasn't there, and they all seemed to think she was going to need special help just because she was human. She had always been good at puzzles and games back on Earth. Maybe these alien puzzles would be different, but she was willing to try. As they left the building to go to their quarters, Katie looked back at the Academy's tall towers and floating platforms. Tomorrow she would find out just how different alien puzzles really were. She hoped she would make her parents proud and show these aliens that humans weren't as limited as they thought. She had no idea that she was about to change everything the galaxy thought they knew about human intelligence. Katie woke up early in her new room at the academy. The walls were made of something that looked like pearl, and they glowed softly when she touched them. Outside her window, she could see the stars and other ships moving around the station. Everything was so different from her bedroom back on Earth, but she was getting excited about her first day of school. Her mom helped her get dressed in the academy uniform, which was a simple blue outfit that felt softer than any clothes she had ever worn. The fabric seemed to adjust itself to fit her perfectly, which was pretty cool. "Remember what we talked about," her mother said as they walked to the dining hall for breakfast. "Just be yourself and do your best. Don't worry about what anyone else can do." The dining hall was huge and filled with the most amazing breakfast Katie had ever seen. There were foods from dozens of different worlds, including some that floated in the air and others that changed colors while you watched. Katie stuck to things that looked familiar, settling on something that tasted like the best pancakes ever, but was bright purple. She sat at a table with other new students. There was Nyx, a young centauri who had silver skin and large black eyes. Next to him sat a girl from Vega who looked almost human, except for the small crystals growing from her forehead. Across from them was a student who looked like he was made of living metal, and his name was something Katie couldn't pronounce. "So you're the human," Nyx said, looking at Katie with curiosity. "I've heard about your species. You're supposed to be pretty basic, right? No special abilities or anything." Katie felt her cheeks get warm again. "I guess not," she said. "I can't read minds or move things without touching them." "That's okay," the vegan girl said kindly. "I'm sure you're good at other things. Humans are supposed to be tough, right? Like you can survive on planets that would kill most of us." "I don't know," Katie said. "I've only ever lived on Earth." After breakfast, all the new students were taken to something called the Cognitive Evaluation Chamber. It was a big round room with no windows, and the walls seemed to be made of flowing light. In the center of the room was a platform where different puzzles appeared when Professor Zeth Kalar touched controls on his tablet. "Today we will test your problem-solving abilities," the professor announced to the group of about 20 new students. "Each of you will attempt our standard evaluation puzzles. These have been carefully designed over thousands of years to measure cognitive function across all known species." He gestured with 2 of his 4 arms, and a complex shape appeared on the platform. It looked like a bunch of geometric pieces floating in the air, some of them glowing, others spinning slowly. Katie thought it looked like a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, but much more complicated than any she had seen before. "This is the Tertiary Spatial Relations Challenge," Professor Zeth Kalar explained. "It requires understanding of 4-dimensional space and complex geometric relationships. Most students require 30 to 40 minutes to complete it on their first attempt." The first student to try was a tall alien with tentacles instead of arms. He approached the puzzle slowly, his tentacles moving in complex patterns as he seemed to calculate something in his head. Katie watched as he carefully moved pieces around, testing different combinations. Sometimes the pieces would glow brighter when they were in the right place, which seemed to help. After 35 minutes, the puzzle made a pleasant chiming sound, and the pieces all glowed bright gold. The student looked tired but pleased, and Professor Zeth Kalar made notes on his tablet. "Acceptable time for an Andromedan student," he said. Next, one by one, the other students took their turns. Nyx used some kind of mathematical approach, moving his hands in the air like he was working with invisible numbers. The vegan girl touched her forehead crystals and seemed to go into a trance before moving the pieces. The metal student's surface rippled and changed color as he worked. All of them took between 25 and 45 minutes to solve the puzzle. Some needed help from Professor Zeth Kalar when they got stuck, but eventually everyone managed to complete it. The professor seemed satisfied with their performance. making encouraging comments about each student's technique and natural abilities. Finally, it was Katie's turn. She walked up to the platform feeling nervous. All the other students had used special abilities or advanced techniques. She didn't have any of those things. She was just a regular human girl who liked puzzles. The geometric shape appeared in front of her, floating at just the right height for her to reach. Up close, it was even more complex than it had looked from a distance. There were dozens of pieces in different shapes and colors, some of them transparent, others solid. They moved and rotated slowly, and Katie could see that some had symbols on them that she didn't recognize. She stood there for a moment, just looking at the puzzle. The other students had all started moving pieces right away, but Katie felt like she needed to understand what she was looking at first. She walked around the platform, seeing the puzzle from different angles. It reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite figure out what. Then she remembered a puzzle box her grandmother had given her for her birthday. It had been all wooden, pieces that fit together in a specific way, and the trick had been to see how all the parts related to each other. This was the same idea, just in more dimensions. Katie could see that some of the pieces had edges that would fit with other pieces, and some of the symbols probably matched up. The colors seemed important too, like maybe pieces of the same color belonged together. She reached out and touched one of the glowing pieces. It felt warm and seemed to respond to her touch by glowing brighter. She moved it to a position where it seemed like it might fit with another piece. When the two pieces came close together, they both glowed and seemed to snap into place with a soft musical note. That felt right. Katie smiled and reached for another piece. This one was shaped like a star, and she could see where it might fit in the growing structure. She moved it into place and was rewarded with another musical note and a flash of golden light. She was starting to see the pattern now. It wasn't just about shapes fitting together. It was about creating something that balanced and flowed, like building a tower, but in directions she couldn't quite name. Her hands seemed to know where the pieces wanted to go, even when her brain wasn't sure why. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together under her fingers. She found herself humming a song her mom used to sing to her, not really thinking about what she was doing. Her hands moved almost on their own, finding the right pieces and putting them in the right places. The room had gone very quiet, but Katie was too focused on the puzzle to notice. She was having fun now, enjoying the way the pieces sang little musical notes when they found their proper places. The whole thing was starting to look like a flower made of light and geometry, beautiful and complex, but somehow simple at the same time. She placed the last piece, a small crystal that seemed to be the heart of the whole structure. The puzzle erupted in golden light and played a beautiful melody that filled the entire chamber. Katie stepped back, pleased with her work. Then she noticed that everyone in the room was staring at her. Professor Zeth Kalar was looking at his tablet like it was broken, pressing buttons and frowning at the screen. The other students were whispering to each other in their various languages, and some of them looked shocked. "Did I do something wrong?" Katie asked, suddenly worried that she had broken the puzzle somehow. Professor Zeth Kalar looked up from his tablet, his compound eyes reflecting the golden light that was still fading from the completed puzzle. "What is your time reading, Katie?" Katie looked around, confused. "My time reading? I don't know what that means." "How long did it take you to solve the puzzle?" he asked, his voice sounding strange. "I don't know," Katie said. "A few minutes, I guess." It was fun. Professor Zeth Kalar pressed more buttons on his tablet, then showed the screen to another teacher who had been watching from the side of the room. They spoke to each other in the professor's language, their voices low and urgent. "Katie, Professor," Zeth Kalar said finally, "according to our instruments, you completed the Tertiary Spatial Relations Challenge in 2 minutes and 57 seconds. Is that good?" Katie asked. The room was completely silent. Even Professor Zeth Kalar seemed to have forgotten how to speak. Finally, Nix broke the silence. "Katie," he said, his voice full of amazement, "no one has ever solved that puzzle in under 20 minutes? Ever. In the history of the Academy." Katie felt her face get hot again, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. Everyone was looking at her like she had done something impossible, but to her, it had just felt like playing with a really interesting toy. She didn't understand what the big deal was. "Can I try another one?" she asked. Professor Zeth Kalar stared at her for a long moment, then slowly began to smile. Word about Katie's amazing puzzle solving spread through the Academy faster than light speed. By lunchtime, teachers and students from all over the station were talking about the little human girl who had broken a record that had stood for over 300 years. Some didn't believe it was true. Others wanted to see her try more puzzles to prove it wasn't just luck. Professor Zeth Kalar found himself in a strange position. For his entire career, he had studied how different species solved problems. He had written books about cognitive development and taught courses on puzzle theory. He thought he understood how intelligent minds worked. But Katie had done something that didn't fit any of his theories. During lunch, he sat in the faculty dining hall with other professors, trying to explain what he had witnessed. "She didn't use any advanced techniques," he told Professor Veltana, the mathematics instructor. "No calculations, no special mental abilities, no systematic analysis. She just looked at the puzzle for a moment, and then started moving pieces like she was playing with toys." "Perhaps the monitoring equipment malfunctioned," suggested Dr. Quill Thara, the Academy's headmaster. She was a tall, elegant being who looked like she was made of living shadow, with stars twinkling in the dark spaces where her face should be. 3 minutes is impossible for that puzzle. Even our most gifted students need at least 20 minutes. "I checked the equipment 3 times, Professor Zeth Kalar replied. "Everything worked perfectly. The child solved the Tertiary Spatial Relations Challenge in 2 minutes and 57 seconds. Professor Veltana leaned forward, her multiple eyes blinking in sequence. What did her parents say about her abilities? Surely they must have noticed something unusual. They mentioned she was good with puzzles, but they seemed as surprised as we were. I don't think they realized how exceptional she might be." After lunch, Professor Zeth Kalar decided to test Katie with more puzzles. He wanted to understand if her first success was really just luck, or if there was something truly special about the way her human brain worked. He found Katie in the recreation area, playing a simple card game with Nix and some other students. She was laughing at something Nix had said, looking like any normal 8-year-old child. It was hard to believe she had just accomplished something that had shocked the entire Academy. "Katie," he said, approaching their table, "would you like to try some more puzzles this afternoon?" Katie looked up with bright, interested eyes. "Sure, that was fun this morning. Do you have harder ones?" Professor Zeth Kalar almost smiled at her enthusiasm. Most students found his puzzles stressful and challenging. Katie talked about them like they were birthday presents. "Yes, I have some more challenging puzzles. Would you like to come to my laboratory?" Katie said goodbye to her new friends and followed Professor Zeth Kalar through the Academy's winding corridors. His laboratory was much bigger than the evaluation chamber, with walls covered in floating displays showing puzzle designs from across the galaxy. Shelves held physical puzzles made from materials Katie had never seen before, some of them glowing, others moving by themselves. "This is amazing," Katie said, looking around with wonder. "Did you make all of these?" "Some of them," Professor Zeth Kalar replied. "Others are traditional puzzles from different worlds. Each species tends to create puzzles that match their natural way of thinking." He gestured to a display area where a new puzzle materialized. This one was much more complex than the morning's challenge. It looked like a miniature galaxy with stars and planets that moved in complex patterns. Some of the celestial bodies were connected by streams of light, and Katie could see symbols and numbers floating around them. This is the Cosmic Harmony Puzzle, Professor Zeth-Kalar explained. It requires understanding of orbital mechanics, mathematical sequences, and multidimensional relationships. Our best students typically need 2 to 3 hours to solve it. Katie walked around the floating galaxy, watching the way the planets moved and the lights pulsed. It was beautiful, like watching a dance performed by stars. She could see that there was a pattern to the movement, but it was more complex than anything she had ever encountered. "What happens when I solve it?" she asked. "The cosmic bodies will align in perfect harmony, and the entire structure will stabilize into a unified pattern," Professor Zeth-Kalar said. He was watching Katie carefully, curious to see how she would approach this much more difficult challenge. Katie reached out and touched one of the planets. It felt warm and seemed to respond to her touch by changing its orbit slightly. She tried moving it to a different position and watched how that affected the other celestial bodies. Some of the connections between them grew brighter, while others dimmed. She spent several minutes just experimenting, learning how the different parts of the puzzle affected each other. Professor Zeth-Kalar noticed that she didn't seem frustrated or overwhelmed by the complexity. Instead, she looked like she was playing with a fascinating new toy. "It's like music," Katie said suddenly. "The planets are like notes, and they need to be in the right places to make a beautiful song." Professor Zeth-Kalar was intrigued by her description. In all his years of studying this puzzle, he had never thought of it in musical terms. Most students approached it as a mathematical problem or a physics simulation. Katie began moving the celestial bodies with more purpose now. She hummed softly to herself, the same tune she had hummed that morning. Her small hands guided planets into new orbits and adjusted the streams of light connecting them. The puzzle began to change, its chaotic movements slowly becoming more organized. "You're doing very well," Professor Zeth-Kalar said encouragingly. "Most students struggle with the initial phase for at least an hour." "It's getting prettier," Katie replied, not taking her eyes off the floating galaxy. "Look, when I put this planet here, all these lights get brighter. And if I move this star just a little bit," she made a small adjustment, and suddenly a whole section of the puzzle clicked into place. The planets in that area began moving in perfect synchronization, and their combined light created beautiful patterns. Professor Zeth-Kalar checked his timer. Katie had been working for only 30 minutes, and she had already solved one of the puzzle's most difficult sections. Students usually needed at least an hour just to understand how that part worked. Katie continued her work, treating each section of the cosmic puzzle like a part of a larger song. She moved planets and stars with growing confidence, and Professor Zeth-Kalar could see that she was beginning to understand the overall pattern. "There," she said after another 20 minutes, making a final adjustment to a small moon. "I think that's right." The entire puzzle suddenly burst into brilliant light. The planets aligned perfectly, the stars pulsed in harmony, and the streams of light between them created a complex geometric pattern that was breathtakingly beautiful. A soft musical tone filled the laboratory, rising and falling like a celestial choir. Professor Zeth-Kalar stared at his timer in disbelief. 53 minutes. Katie had solved the Cosmic Harmony puzzle in less than an hour. The previous record had been 2 hours and 47 minutes, set by a graduate student from Rigel who had specialized in cosmic mechanics for over a decade. "Did I do it right?" Katie asked, looking at the professor with slight concern. "It sounds pretty, but I want to make sure it's what you wanted." "You did it perfectly," Professor Zeth-Kalar said, his voice filled with amazement. "Katie, do you realize what you've just accomplished?" Katie shrugged. "I solved another puzzle. It was really fun." The way all the planets danced together at the end was beautiful. Over the next few days, Professor Zeth Kalar presented Katie with puzzle after puzzle. There was the temporal logic chain, which required understanding how cause and effect worked across multiple timelines. Katie solved it while asking questions about what the professor ate for breakfast on his home planet. There was the 11-dimensional maze, which had driven several doctoral students to change their field of study. Katie navigated it in record time while humming and chatting about her new friends. Each success drew more attention from the Academy's faculty. Professors began visiting Professor Zeth Kalar's laboratory to witness Katie's abilities for themselves. They brought puzzles from their own specialties, confident that their particular area of expertise would finally challenge the little human girl. Katie solved them all. She approached each new puzzle with the same cheerful curiosity, treating impossible challenges like entertaining games. She never seemed stressed or worried about failing. When she got stuck, she would step back, look at the puzzle from a different angle, and then try a completely new approach. What amazed Professor Zeth Kalar most was that Katie never used the same method twice. While other species had consistent, predictable approaches to problem solving, Katie seemed to invent a new technique for every puzzle. She had an unlimited toolbox of creative solutions. During one session, while Katie was working on a puzzle that involved manipulating streams of pure energy, Dr. Lisa Brooks came to visit. "How is she doing?" Katie's mother asked, watching her daughter bend light into impossible shapes. "She's rewriting everything we thought we knew about intelligence," Professor Zeth Kalar replied honestly. "Katie doesn't solve puzzles the way other species do." Professor Zeth Kalar stood in the Academy's main conference room, facing a group of the most important academics in the galaxy. Headmaster Quill Thara sat at the head of the long table, her starry form flickering with what he recognized as nervous energy. Around the table sat department heads from every major species, all of them looking skeptical about what they had heard. "You're telling us," said Professor Valtana slowly, "that this human child has solved every puzzle you've presented to her, including ones that have stumped our best graduate students." "That's correct," Professor Zeth Kalar replied. "In the past week, Katie has broken 17 Academy records. Some of these puzzles were considered nearly impossible." Dr. Kethmer, the Academy's most respected cognitive scientist, leaned forward. His crystalline body chimed softly as he moved. "There must be some mistake. Humans are a newly developed species. Their brains are primitive compared to ours. This cannot be accurate." "I've checked and double-checked everything," Professor Zeth Kalar insisted. "Katie Brooks is unlike anything we've seen before. Her approach to problem-solving challenges every theory we have about intelligence." Headmaster Kulthar raised one shadowy hand for silence. "If what you say is true, then perhaps it's time to present her with the ultimate test." The room fell completely quiet. Everyone knew what she meant, but no one wanted to say it out loud. "You can't mean the Nexus Paradox," Professor Veltana whispered. "That puzzle has been unsolved for 800 years. Some of our greatest minds have declared it impossible." "Exactly," Headmaster Quilthara replied. "If this human child is truly as exceptional as Professor Zeth Kalar claims, then she should be given the chance to face our greatest challenge." Professor Zeth Kalar felt his heart's beating faster. The Nexus Paradox was legendary throughout the galaxy. It was more than just a puzzle. It was a test of the fundamental limits of consciousness itself. Many brilliant minds had tried to solve it and failed. Some had become so obsessed with it that they had to be treated for mental exhaustion. "Are you sure that's wise?" he asked. "Katie is still just a child. The psychological pressure alone could be harmful." "The child seems remarkably resistant to pressure," Dr. Kethmer observed. "According to your reports, she treats impossible puzzles like games. Perhaps her youth is actually an advantage." Headmaster Quilthara stood up, her form growing taller and more imposing. The decision is made. We will present Katie Brooks with the Nexus Paradox. If she succeeds, it will change everything we thought we knew about intelligence. If she fails, at least we will have confirmation that there are limits to this phenomenon. Professor Zethkalar left the meeting feeling worried. He had grown fond of Katie over the past week. She was curious, cheerful, and completely unaware of how remarkable her abilities were. The thought of her facing the puzzle that had broken so many great minds made him uncomfortable. He found Katie in the Academy's garden area, playing with a group of alien children. They were all laughing as they chased floating balls of light that changed colors when touched. Katie was running around with the same joy as any 8-year-old, completely ordinary except for the extraordinary things she could do. Katie, he called, "Could I speak with you for a moment?" She said goodbye to her friends and skipped over to him. "Hi, Professor Z. Do you have another puzzle for me today? I've been hoping you'd have something really challenging." Professor Zethkalar almost smiled despite his concerns. Only Katie would ask for harder puzzles after breaking record after record. "Actually, yes," he said, "but this one is different from the others. It's much more difficult, and many very smart people have tried to solve it without success. You don't have to try it if you don't want to." Katie's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really? A puzzle that no one has solved? That sounds amazing. When? Can I try it?" Her enthusiasm made Professor Zethkalar feel both proud and worried. "Tomorrow morning. But Katie, I want you to understand something. If you can't solve this puzzle, that doesn't mean you've failed. Some things might just be impossible." "Okay," Katie said cheerfully, "but I'd still like to try. It sounds fun." That evening, Katie's parents came to Professor Zethkalar's laboratory. Word had reached them about the next day's challenge, and they were concerned. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," Commander Brooks said. "Katie's just a little girl. All this pressure and attention is a lot for her to handle." "She seems to be handling it well," Dr. Brooks added, "but I worry about what happens if she can't solve this puzzle. Will it hurt her confidence?" Professor Zethkalar understood their concerns. "I've tried to explain to the Academy leadership that Katie is still a child, but they're convinced this test is necessary. They need to understand the limits of her abilities." "What exactly is this Nexus Paradox?" Dr. Brooks asked Professor. Zethkalar gestured to a display screen where complex diagrams appeared. "It's a puzzle that incorporates advanced mathematics, quantum mechanics, temporal dynamics, and multidimensional physics. It's not just difficult, it challenges the fundamental nature of how we understand reality." The diagrams show geometric shapes that seem to exist in more dimensions than the eye could follow, connected by lines that curved through space in impossible ways. Symbols and equations floated around the shapes, constantly changing and evolving. It was created 800 years ago by a collective of the galaxy's greatest minds. Professor Zethkalar continued. They wanted to design the ultimate test of intelligence. Instead, they created something that might be unsolvable. Commander Brooks studied the diagrams with a frown. "It looks like it would give me a headache just looking at it." "Many students have reported exactly that," Professor Zethkalar admitted. "A puzzle is designed to push consciousness to its limits. Some philosophers believe it reveals the fundamental boundaries of what any mind can understand." The next morning, the Academy's largest observation chamber was filled with faculty members, government representatives, and students. Word had spread throughout the station that the legendary Nexus Paradox was finally going to be attempted again. Some had come to witness history being made. Others were there to see the human child finally meet a challenge she couldn't overcome. Katie walked into the chamber holding her parents' hands, looking tiny compared to the massive crowd of aliens watching her. She wore her regular academy uniform and had her hair in the same ponytails she always wore. She looked like she was going to a birthday party, rather than attempting to solve the galaxy's greatest puzzle. The Nexus paradox materialized in the center of the chamber, and even Katie stopped to stare. It was enormous, filling the space from floor to ceiling with geometric forms that hurt to look at directly. Parts of it seemed to exist in dimensions that the eye couldn't quite follow. Symbols and numbers flowed around it like living things, constantly changing and rearranging themselves. Katie, Headmaster Quilthara, announced to the crowd, "You are about to attempt the Nexus paradox. This puzzle has remained unsolved for 800 years. No one expects you to succeed, but the Academy wishes to understand the limits of your abilities." Katie nodded politely, but Professor Zith-Kalar could see that she was more interested in the puzzle than in the speech. Her eyes were already studying the complex structure, and he could almost see her mind starting to work. "Take all the time you need," Headmaster Quilthara continued. "There is no time limit, and you may ask for help if you become overwhelmed." Katie walked slowly around the massive puzzle, much more cautiously than she had approached the others. This was clearly different from anything she had seen before. The other puzzles had been complex, but they had still looked like puzzles. This looked more like a piece of the universe itself, torn out and rearranged in ways that shouldn't be possible. She spent nearly 20 minutes just observing, longer than she had ever taken to study a puzzle before. She walked around it from every angle, sometimes reaching out as if to touch something, but then pulling her hand back. The crowd watched in complete silence, hardly daring to breathe. Professor Zeth-Kalar found himself holding his breath too. He had never seen Katie look so serious before. For the first time since he had met her, she looked like she understood that she was facing something truly difficult. Finally, Katie spoke. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's like looking at the inside of reality itself." She reached out and touched one small part of the puzzle, a gently glowing sphere that seemed more stable than the rest. The moment her finger made contact, part of the massive structure shifted slightly, and new patterns began to emerge in the flowing symbols. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. "So that's how it works." Professor Zeth-Kalar realized that Katie had just figured out something that had eluded everyone else who had attempted the puzzle. She had found the key to understanding how the Nexus paradox operated. Katie began to work, her small hands moving through the impossible geometry with growing confidence. The crowd watched in amazement as the chaotic structure began to respond to her touch, becoming more organized and purposeful. For the first time in 800 years, the Nexus paradox was beginning to change. Katie worked on the Nexus paradox for over 2 hours, and the entire chamber remained completely silent the whole time. Even the youngest students understood they were watching something that had never happened before in the history of the galaxy. Professor Zeth-Kalar watched Katie's approach with growing amazement. While previous attempts at the puzzle had involved complex calculations and systematic analysis, Katie treated it like she was having a conversation with the structure itself. She would touch one part and wait to see how it responded, then adjust something else based on what she learned. "She's not trying to force a solution," he whispered to Dr. Brooks, who was standing beside him with tears in her eyes. "She's letting the puzzle teach her how it wants to be solved." Katie seemed completely unaware of the crowd watching her. She hummed softly to herself, the same tune she always hummed when working on puzzles. Her small hands moved through the impossible geometry with growing confidence, and the chaotic structure began to respond to her guidance. The symbols and numbers that had been flowing randomly around the puzzle started to form patterns. The geometric shapes that had seemed to exist in too many dimensions began to settle into configurations that the watching aliens could actually follow with their eyes. The harsh, painful light that had made the puzzle difficult to look at softened into something beautiful and warm. "Look at section 7, Professor Valtana whispered urgently to her colleague. "The temporal displacement equations are actually stabilizing." "Impossible," Dr. Kethmer replied, his crystalline body chiming with excitement. "Those equations have been chaotic for 8 centuries. As Katie continued her work, more and more parts of the puzzle began to fall into place. What had looked like random chaos was revealing itself to have an underlying order that no one had ever seen before. The puzzle wasn't broken or impossible. It had just been waiting for someone who could understand its true nature. "It's like music," Katie said suddenly, speaking to the puzzle rather than to anyone in the chamber. "You're all singing different songs, but you want to sing together, don't you?" She made a series of small adjustments, her movements becoming faster and more confident. The floating symbols began to pulse in rhythm, and the geometric shapes started, rotating in harmony with each other. The entire structure began to glow with a warm, golden light that filled the chamber. "She's almost done," Professor Zethkalar breathed. "After 800 years, she's actually going to solve it." Katie stepped back and looked at her work, tilting her head like she was listening to something only she could hear. Then she smiled and reached out to touch one final symbol, a small star-shaped glyph that had been floating at the very center of the puzzle. The moment her finger touched it, the entire Nexus paradox transformed. All the chaos and confusion that had made it seem impossible suddenly resolved into perfect harmony. The geometric shapes aligned themselves into a beautiful crystalline structure that pulsed with gentle light. The symbols and equations arranged themselves into elegant patterns that told a story of cosmic mathematics. The puzzle sang with a sound like distant stars, beautiful and peaceful. The completion tone that rang through the chamber was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. It wasn't just the sound of a puzzle being solved. It was the sound of understanding itself, of order emerging from chaos, of impossible things becoming possible. For a long moment, nobody moved, and the chamber erupted in chaos as faculty members rushed toward their instruments, students cheered, and government representatives began talking urgently into communication devices. Katie looked around at all the excitement with confusion. "Did I do it right?" she asked Professor Zethkalar, who was staring at the completed puzzle with tears in his compound eyes. "You did it perfectly," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Katie, you just solved the Nexus paradox. You accomplished something that no one in the galaxy has been able to do for 800 years. "Oh," Katie said, looking pleased but not particularly surprised. "It was really pretty once I figured out what it wanted to be. Can I try another one tomorrow?" Headmaster Quill Thara approached them, her shadowy form flickering with what Professor Zethkalar recognized as deep emotion. "Katie Brooks," she said formally, "you have achieved something that will be remembered for thousands of years. How did you do it? What was your method?" Katie thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I just listened to it. All the pieces were trying to tell me where they belonged. I just had to pay attention and help them get there." Professor Zethkalar felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of intelligence. For his entire career, he had believed that the most advanced minds were those that could perform the most complex calculations, access the most sophisticated abilities, or process information at the highest speeds. But Katie had just proven that sometimes the most powerful approach was also the simplest one. While other species had spent centuries developing increasingly complex methods of analysis, Katie had succeeded by going back to the most basic principle of all, listening. She didn't try to impose her will on the puzzle or force it to submit to her intelligence. Instead, she treated it as a partner in a collaborative process. "Professor Zethkalar," Headmaster Quilthara said, "I believe we need to completely revise our understanding of human cognitive abilities. This child has demonstrated something that challenges everything we thought we knew about intelligence. Over the following days, news of Katie's achievements spread throughout the galaxy. Scientists and educators from dozens of worlds requested copies of the recordings, trying to understand how a human child had accomplished the impossible. Academic journals published special issues devoted to analyzing her methods. Philosophers debated what her success meant for the nature of consciousness itself. But perhaps the most important changes happened right at the Academy. Professor Zeth Kalar found himself questioning all of his previous assumptions about how minds worked and how problems should be solved. He began redesigning his courses to include human-style approaches. Alongside the traditional methods each species had developed, other professors started doing the same thing. Professor Valtana introduced intuitive mathematics, classes where students were encouraged to feel their way toward solutions rather than calculating them. Dr. Kefmer began teaching collaborative problem-solving where students worked with puzzles as partners rather than opponents. The Academy's entire philosophy began to shift. Instead of focusing only on each species' natural strengths, they started encouraging students to learn from other approaches. The rigid categories that had separated different types of intelligence began to break down. Katie's parents found their diplomatic mission transformed overnight. Instead of being treated as representatives of a primitive species seeking acceptance, they were now welcomed as ambassadors from a civilization that had unique and valuable contributions to make to galactic society. The Galactic Council wants to fast-track Earth's membership application. Commander Brooks told his wife one evening as they watched Katie play with her friends in the Academy's garden. They're saying that humanity brings a perspective that the galaxy has been missing. I'm proud of her, Dr. Brooks replied, but I hope all this attention doesn't change who she is. They didn't need to worry. Katie remained the same cheerful, curious child she had always been. She continued to treat impossible puzzles like fun games, made friends with students from across the galaxy, and asked if she could have ice cream for dessert every night. The only thing that changed was how others saw her. Where they had once seen a primitive human child, they now saw a representative of a species with remarkable gifts. But Katie herself remained wonderfully, completely ordinary in all the ways that mattered most. Professor Zeth Kalar wrote his final report on Katie's abilities with a sense of humility he had never felt before. In it, he concluded that humanity's greatest strength wasn't any single ability or technique. Instead, it was their capacity to approach problems with fresh eyes, free from the assumptions and limitations that even the most advanced species had developed over millions of years. Of evolution. Katie had solved the Nexus paradox, not because she was smarter than everyone else, but because she was different. Her human mind, unspecialized and adaptable, could see solutions that more advanced brains had missed. Her youth allowed her to approach ancient problems without the weight of centuries of failed attempts. As Professor Zeth Kalar submitted his report to the Academy's archives, he realized that Katie had taught him the most important lesson of his career. Sometimes the most sophisticated answer wasn't the best answer. Sometimes the key to solving impossible problems was to approach them with the wonder, curiosity, and open-minded creativity of a child. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again, and humanity would take its place among the stars. Not as junior partners, but as teachers with wisdom that even the most ancient civilizations could learn from. And Katie Brooks, the little girl who had changed everything, asked her parents if she could have pancakes for breakfast tomorrow.